In early 1945, the fighting in the Pacific had entered a phase in which Allied forces were systematically dismantling Japan's remaining island strongholds. The Philippines, invaded by Japanese forces in 1941 to 1942, had become central to both Japanese and Allied calculations. For Tokyo, the archipelago formed a shield between the home islands and the resource areas of the Netherlands East Indies. For Washington and its partners, regaining these islands was essential to cutting Japan's sea lanes to oil and raw materials and creating airfields and ports for later operations toward Borneo and, ultimately, Japan itself. By March 1945, major battles on Leyte and Luzon were already underway, but substantial Japanese forces still held the southern Philippines. Command of the Allied effort there lay with Lieutenant General Robert L. Eichelberger's 8th Army, responsible for a vast area stretching hundreds of kilometers from Palawan through the Visayas to Mindanao. Opposing him was the Japanese 35th Army, with roughly 100,000 troops scattered over these islands, of which only an estimated 30,000 were organized as effective combat units after earlier losses. Within this southern zone, the Zamboanga Peninsula on western Mindanao had specific geographic and operational significance. A long, narrow landmass jutting toward Borneo, it controlled approaches between the Sulu Sea and the Celebes Sea, and contained anchorages and potential airfield sites from which aircraft could reach shipping lanes and oil installations in the Netherlands East Indies. Allied planners recognized that bases on Palawan, Zamboanga, and the Sulu archipelago together would allow bombers and fighters to interdict Japanese maritime traffic across the South China Sea and toward Borneo more effectively. Japanese forces had moved into Zamboanga during the 1942 occupation and integrated it into a wider defensive network intended to slow or deter any Allied return. By early 1945, responsibility for the area rested with the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade, part of 35th Army. Intelligence assessments estimated that nearly 9,000 Japanese personnel, built around this brigade and associated service units, were concentrated on the peninsula, with their main defensive system around Zamboanga City at its southern tip. For the local Filipino population, Japanese rule meant a combination of military control, economic disruption, and the growth of resistance networks. Pre-war Zamboanga had been a regional trading center, linking Mindanao with other Philippine islands and with Borneo. Under occupation, shipping restrictions and requisitions affected food supplies and commerce. At the same time, guerrilla organizations formed in the peninsula's interior and coastal villages. These groups collected intelligence, maintained links with exiled or clandestine Philippine authorities, and prepared to support any Allied landing, though their capabilities varied from lightly armed local bands to more structured units coordinating with Allied radios. At the strategic level, decisions about Zamboanga were tied to debates among Allied leaders about how extensively to commit forces in the Philippines. While some planners argued for limiting operations after securing Luzon, General Douglas MacArthur pressed for liberation of the remaining islands, citing both military and political reasons. The use of ports and airfields for subsequent campaigns, the desire to sever Japanese communications to the south, and the commitment made to Philippine civilians and soldiers since 1942. In February 1945, he ordered a sequence of operations under the codename Victor, including the seizure of Palawan, Victor III, and then the Zamboanga Peninsula and parts of the Sulu archipelago, Victor IV. To execute these southern operations, MacArthur assigned Eichelberger the 8th Army's ground forces and relied on Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid's 7th Fleet for naval support. Within this framework, Major General Jens A. Doe's 41st Infantry Division was selected for the Palawan and Zamboanga assaults. The division, experienced in previous campaigns in New Guinea and on Biak, would have to conduct amphibious landings, secure airfields, and then push inland into terrain of mangrove swamps, low coastal plains, and steep forested hills that favored defenders who had months to prepare bunkers, trenches, and minefields. Japanese planners on the peninsula faced their own constraints. The 54th Independent Mixed Brigade, while on paper comparable in numbers to a regular division, had previously contributed personnel to other fighting, and had limited heavy equipment and mechanized transport. Its commanders expected to rely on prepared positions in rugged ground north of Zamboanga City and on the psychological and tactical advantages of defense. Concealed artillery, interlocking fields of fire, and extensive obstacles to slow an attacker whose strength they could not match in open maneuver. At the same time, many Japanese units across the southern Philippines anticipated, based on their reading of Allied priorities, that some garrisons might simply be bypassed, leaving uncertainty about how soon and where a major landing would occur. By the beginning of March 1945, these elements had converged into a specific operational problem. For the Allies, Zamboanga offered a way to extend the network of airfields outward from Leyte and Mindoro, protect sea routes, and set conditions for later operations on Mindanao and Borneo. For the Japanese, holding the peninsula was part of a broader effort to delay Allied advances and preserve a defensive perimeter around the resource areas to the southwest. For Filipino civilians and guerrillas, the anticipated battle promised the end of occupation, but also raised the prospect of bombardment, displacement, and reprisals. The Battle of Zamboanga, which would open with amphibious landings on March 10, 1945, emerged from this intersection of strategic calculation, local geography, and the cumulative pressures of a global war entering its final year. On the 6th of February 1945, General Douglas MacArthur issued formal orders to extend operations into the southern Philippines, including Palawan, Mindanao, and the islands of the Sulu archipelago. Operational control over these landings passed to Lieutenant General Robert L. Eichelberger's 8th Army, which was to employ a flexible force of 5 infantry divisions and a parachute regimental combat team across multiple, nearly simultaneous assaults. Within this framework, Major General Jens A. Doe's 41st Infantry Division received responsibility for the twin tasks coded Victor III and Victor IV, first Palawan, then the Zamboanga Peninsula. For the Zamboanga operation, the 41st Division reorganized around 2 main regimental combat teams, the 162nd and 163rd Infantry Regiments, supported by attached artillery, engineers, medical units, and service troops. The division's 3rd Regiment, the 186th Infantry, was assigned to seize Palawan in late February to provide airfields from which Allied aircraft could help isolate Japanese forces in the southern Philippines. Once Palawan was secured, the remaining elements of the division would move by convoy toward the Zamboanga Peninsula, staging for an amphibious landing on its southwestern tip. Opposite them, Japanese forces on the peninsula were organized around the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade, part of 35th Army, which was responsible for a broad sector of the southern Philippines. The brigade's units had spent months constructing defensive works in depth, with initial positions along the coastal plain and more elaborate strongpoints in the broken, forested terrain several kilometers inland. As supply lines from Luzon and the Netherlands East Indies deteriorated, the brigade's planners increasingly assumed they would have to fight with limited artillery ammunition, restricted fuel, and dependence on local requisitioning for food. Before any landing craft approached Zamboanga's shore, 8th Army and the 41st Division relied heavily on intelligence gathered by Filipino guerrilla organizations across Mindanao and the peninsula. Networks associated with American officer Wendell Fertig and local leaders reported on Japanese troop dispositions, condition of coastal defenses, and the state of roads and potential airstrip sites. These reports suggested that Japanese forces were shifting their main positions away from the immediate shoreline toward higher ground inland, accepting the loss of the beach in order to fight on more favorable terrain. In late February and early March, movement toward Zamboanga proceeded in phases. Elements of the 41st Division embarked from staging areas in the central Philippines and sailed south through waters that, until recently, had been threatened by Japanese naval and air units. Escorting warships of the 7th Fleet's amphibious forces provided anti-submarine and anti-aircraft cover, while transport groups rehearsed unloading drills meant to reduce time spent vulnerable close to shore. For the soldiers on board, this phase presented little contact with the enemy, but marked the transition from earlier campaigns in New Guinea and the Central Philippines to a new unfamiliar battlefield on the fringes of the Sulu Sea. As the convoys approached the Zamboanga Peninsula, Allied air and naval forces began shaping the landing area. 13th Air Force bombers and fighter bombers struck targets around Zamboanga City, nearby airstrips, and suspected artillery positions. Over several days, cruisers and destroyers of the covering force conducted systematic bombardments of coastal batteries, supply dumps, and visible defensive works behind the beaches designated for the assault. The intention was to disrupt command and communications, destroy heavy weapons that could fire on landing craft, and create conditions under which the infantry regiments could move quickly off the sand toward inland objectives. On the Japanese side, these preparatory attacks confirmed expectations that a landing on the peninsula was imminent, but did not fully reveal where or when it would fall. Commanders of the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade faced a choice between contesting the beaches directly or preserving their main strength in prepared inland positions. Available accounts indicate that they left only limited outposts near the shore, concentrating the majority of their troops in fortified zones in the hills north of Zamboanga City, where they believed the terrain would offset Allied advantages in armor and artillery. By the evening of 9th March 1945, the opening phase of the Battle of Zamboanga had reached its final preparatory stage. The 41st Division's assault troops were loaded into landing ships and craft in Basilan Strait, south of the peninsula, organized into serials that would carry the 162nd Infantry in the first wave, with the 163rd close behind. Offshore, naval gunfire ships maintained intermittent bombardment, and aircraft from bases at Palawan and Dipolog stood by for calls to strike specific targets. On the beaches near the barrio of San Mateo, a few kilometers west of Zamboanga City, Japanese outposts observed the growing activity at sea, while in the interior, the main body of the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade waited in its hill positions for the ground battle that would begin with the landing scheduled for the morning of March 10th. In planning the Zamboanga operation, Allied commanders assigned the 41st Infantry Division a set of clearly defined objectives. The immediate military goal was to seize a beachhead on the southwestern tip of the peninsula near San Mateo, capture Zamboanga City, and secure nearby high ground. Once this was accomplished, engineers were to construct or rehabilitate airfields close enough to support air operations across the Sulu Sea and toward Borneo. Longer term, the new bases at Zamboanga were intended to form one link in a chain of air and naval facilities stretching from Leyte through Palawan to the southern Philippines, and, eventually, to staging areas for operations around Borneo and the Netherlands East Indies. Within the division, staff officers translated these objectives into a phased scheme of maneuver. The 162nd Infantry Regimental Combat Team would conduct the initial assault landing, establish a firm lodgment on the coastal strip, and push rapidly eastward toward Zamboanga City. The 163rd Infantry would land in close succession to widen the beachhead, secure flanks, and be prepared to reinforce the main axis of advance or respond to counterattacks. Attached artillery battalions were assigned pre-arranged fire plans, with initial concentrations along suspected Japanese positions, inland from the beaches and on known strong points around the city. Logistics planning was central to this concept. Experience in New Guinea had demonstrated to the 41st Division that units arriving without sufficient supplies could be delayed on the beach and exposed to enemy fire. For Zamboanga, staff officers calculated daily requirements in ammunition, fuel, rations, and medical support for an operation expected to last weeks rather than days. Landing schedules for LSTs and smaller craft were arranged so that, alongside combat units, engineer battalions, medical detachments, and supply troops would be present from the opening hours. This planning extended from major ports in the central Philippines down to the order in which individual vehicles and crates would be positioned inside each ship. Naval and air commanders integrated their own plans with those of the ground forces. Amphibious task groups prepared detailed timetables for pre-landing bombardment, suppression of coastal guns, and the marking of channels through reefs and shoals for landing craft. Air units were briefed on target lists that included communication centers, ammunition depots, and road junctions leading to the inland defensive line. Communication procedures were established so that forward observers and liaison officers could call for adjustments in naval gunfire and air support once the infantry was ashore and had more precise information about Japanese positions. Japanese planners on the peninsula, facing inferior naval and air resources, adopted a different approach. The 54th Independent Mixed Brigade could not expect reinforcement by sea or air on any significant scale once an Allied landing began. Its concept therefore emphasized a static, layered defense. Forward outposts near the coast would provide warning and, if possible, inflict losses during the landing itself. The bulk of the brigade was concentrated in a defensive belt several kilometers inland, positioned in rugged hills and ridges where visibility was limited and attack routes could be channeled by natural obstacles and prepared minefields. Engineers and infantry units had spent months constructing bunkers of earth, logs, and concrete where available, often dug into slopes and connected by trenches and covered communication routes. Fields of fire were organized to overlap, with machine guns covering likely avenues of approach and artillery and mortars registered on road segments and open spaces that attackers would have to cross. Stocks of ammunition and food were dispersed among multiple positions to reduce vulnerability to bombardment, but overall supplies remained limited by the strain on Japanese shipping and the need to share resources with other garrisons in the southern Philippines. Both sides made use of intelligence and estimates that contained uncertainties. Allied planners relied heavily on guerrilla reports and aerial reconnaissance to gauge Japanese strength. These sources suggested that the main force numbered in the thousands, rather than tens of thousands, and that heavy weapons were present but not abundant. However, dense vegetation and camouflage made precise targeting difficult, and staff officers could not be sure whether the main defensive line lay close to the shore or deeper inland. Japanese commanders, for their part, had observed Allied movements toward Palawan and other islands, but could not determine the exact timing or composition of the force approaching Zamboanga until the final days. Propaganda and communication with domestic and local audiences also formed part of the preparation. Allied statements emphasized the liberation of Philippine territory, the restoration of civil authority, and cooperation with guerrilla forces. Japanese internal communications stressed the necessity of holding positions as long as possible to protect links with the resource areas to the south, even under conditions of isolation. Neither side controlled how civilians around Zamboanga City interpreted these messages, but both understood that local cooperation or resistance could influence intelligence, labor availability, and the security of rear areas once fighting moved inland. By the night before the landings, the planning phase had been translated into concrete arrangements. Ships lay loaded according to predetermined tables. Artillery observers knew their initial target reference points, and engineer units had specific assignments to clear obstacles, open roads, and begin work on airstrips once ground conditions allowed. In the hills north of the city, Japanese units occupied their positions in the defensive belt they had prepared, aware that their doctrine now emphasized holding ground and inflicting delay rather than maneuver. The decisions taken in these weeks of planning on both sides would shape the character of the fighting that followed when the assault waves moved toward the beaches on March 10, 1945. Shortly after first light on 10 March 1945, the naval and air preparation for the Zamboanga landing reached its final stage. For 3 days, cruisers and destroyers had shelled suspected Japanese positions west of Zamboanga City, while aircraft from 13th Air Force struck warehouses, airstrips, and road junctions around the planned beachhead. In the hours before the first wave moved in, ships shifted to closer fire, concentrating on the coastal strip near the barrio of San Mateo, about 5 kilometers west of the city. At the designated H hour, landing craft carrying the 162nd Infantry moved toward shore in ordered waves, guided by control vessels that had marked channels through shallow water and reefs. As ramps went down on the sandy strip near San Mateo, the troops encountered far less fire than many had anticipated. The bombardment had hit the abandoned coastal defenses, but the main reason for the limited resistance lay in Japanese decisions taken weeks earlier. The 54th Independent Mixed Brigade had already pulled its principal forces back to higher ground, several kilometers inland, leaving only small outposts and observers near the beaches. Within a short time, units of the 162nd Infantry secured a shallow perimeter around the landing zone. Engineers followed close behind, marking lanes across the sand, clearing scattered mines and obstacles, and beginning work on beach exits for vehicles. Artillery batteries came ashore with their guns loaded on landing craft and were positioned in open areas just inland, prepared to fire on prearranged targets if Japanese positions revealed themselves. The 163rd Infantry, landing in subsequent waves, extended the beachhead to the east and west, giving the division a continuous frontage from which to begin movement toward Zamboanga City. Allied accounts describe only intermittent Japanese fire during these first hours, mostly from isolated machine guns and mortars that had not yet been located by naval or air observers. Some of these positions were bypassed and reduced later by small infantry detachments. Others were abandoned by their garrisons, which withdrew toward the main inland line. The absence of a concentrated beach defense reduced casualties during the landing phase and allowed the division to bring ashore its service units, vehicles, and supplies according to plan. As the beachhead stabilized, patrols from the 162nd Infantry began probing eastward along the coastal road toward Zamboanga City. The advance encountered limited organized resistance in the built-up outskirts. Some Japanese groups fired from houses or improvised positions and then withdrew, while others were cut off and engaged at close range. Damage from pre-landing bombardment, including collapsed structures and cratered streets, complicated movement, but also reduced the number of intact positions available to defenders. By the end of the first day, forward elements had entered parts of the city, while other units secured key road junctions to prevent counterattacks against the beachhead. For civilians in and around Zamboanga City, these opening engagements produced a rapid shift in conditions. Many residents had already moved away from the waterfront during the bombardment, seeking shelter in inland barrios or in improvised dugouts and basements. The arrival of American troops, often preceded or accompanied by local guerrilla guides, brought both the expectation of the end of occupation and the immediate challenges of disrupted water, food distribution, and medical services. Guerrilla units, familiar with terrain and neighborhoods, assisted in identifying remaining Japanese positions and in directing civilians away from active combat zones. By 11th March, organized Japanese resistance in central Zamboanga City had largely ceased, and attention shifted to securing the surrounding area and key infrastructure. Reconnaissance elements and engineers inspected nearby airfield sites, including the area at Moray, which had been used before and during the occupation, to determine how quickly runways could be repaired or extended for use by Allied aircraft. Holding the city and adjacent coastal strip created a secure base for supply dumps, field hospitals, and command posts, but it did not yet confront the main Japanese defensive system in the hills to the north. The first clear indications of that inland system came from patrols moving off the coastal plain into the rising ground beyond. Infantry reconnaissance and guerrilla reports describe successive lines of trenches, bunkers, and obstacles constructed along ridges 2 to 3 miles from the shore. Mines, barbed wire, and carefully sited firing positions suggested that the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade intended to fight a protracted defensive battle there, rather than risk its core strength in counterattacks against the new beachhead. The relatively limited clashes of the initial landings thus gave way, in the days after 10th March, to preparations on both sides for a more demanding phase of the campaign in the interior. Once the coastal plain and Zamboanga City were secured by March 11th, the character of the operation changed from rapid advance to a methodical climb into the peninsula's interior. The 41st Infantry Division now faced the main task identified in 8th Army's planning, removing Japanese units from the high ground overlooking the newly captured airfields at Wolf and San Roque, and from the ridges that dominated the routes north. The 163rd Infantry began moving up the Tumaga River Valley toward the objective of Mount Pulangbata, about 8 kilometers inland, while the 162nd advanced in 2 columns from San Roque and Malisay toward Mount Capisan. Japanese forces of the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade had concentrated here a defensive system that extended across roughly 8 kilometers of front and up to 5 kilometers in depth. Their positions were anchored on successive ridges, each protected by barbed wire, concealed machine gun nests, trench networks, and artillery and mortar concentrations. Ground that they had abandoned closer to the coast was left with booby traps and minefields, including some installations designed for remote detonation. Initially, the brigade still possessed a usable stock of automatic weapons and indirect fire ammunition, allowing it to contest each American move with organized fire rather than isolated skirmishes. The terrain itself intensified the crisis for both attackers and defenders. The foothills north of Zamboanga gave way to dense secondary growth and, farther inland, to rain forest along the spine of the peninsula. Visibility from one ridge to the next was often limited by vegetation and broken ground. Existing trails were narrow and poorly maintained, unsuited to steady vehicle traffic. The 41st Division's advance therefore proceeded at the pace of engineer bulldozers, which cut and improved supply and evacuation tracks as infantry moved forward. Tanks, useful on the coastal plain, could not operate off these new roads once the troops entered the foothills, reducing Allied advantages in armor. Guerrilla forces under Colonel Wendell Fertig were integrated into this phase with a specific task: blocking any Japanese attempt to withdraw north along the East Coast Road. To prevent a repeat of the maneuver that Phil-American troops had once planned in 1942, 8th Army directed guerrilla formations to occupy the Belong area, about 30 kilometers north-northeast of Zamboanga City. Captain Donald Lecouvre's 121st Infantry, Guerrilla 105th Division, established positions there, closing the main coastal route and forcing any large Japanese movement to cross the mountainous interior, where supplies were harder to obtain, and Allied patrols could interfere more effectively. From 12th March onward, the fighting escalated into a pattern of daily assaults and nightly counterattacks. American infantry companies advanced ridge by ridge behind scheduled artillery barrages, then attempted to consolidate positions before dark. Japanese units, often operating in small groups familiar with the terrain, used the cover of night to probe gaps, infiltrate forward foxholes, and launch limited counterattacks intended to inflict losses and delay construction of new supply tracks. Reports from this period describe frequent mortar fire against road-building parties and evacuation columns, as the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade tried to slow the development of a permanent Allied logistics network in the hills. Air support intensified as airfield construction advanced. By March 15th, engineers had completed a 1,500-meter dry-weather runway at San Roque, enabling Marine and Army aircraft to operate directly from the Zamboanga area. These aircraft flew close support missions for units engaged on the slopes of Mount Capisan and Mount Pulangbata, attacking identified gun positions, supply points, and assembly areas ahead of infantry advances. At the same time, they continued to strike targets across the Sulu Sea and to support parallel operations on Basilan and other islands, tying the Zamboanga battle into a wider regional campaign. For the Japanese side, the escalation meant a steady increase in pressure on a force that had little prospect of reinforcement or relief. Higher command in the southern Philippines had already concluded that major reinforcements could not be spared for Zamboanga, and existing shortages in artillery ammunition, transport, and medical supplies documented across the southern islands were also present on the peninsula. Unit commanders attempted to compensate by economizing on artillery fire, relying more on small arms and mortars, and by dispersing stocks of food and ammunition in multiple bunkers to reduce losses from air and artillery strikes. Civilians in the foothill villages experienced this phase as a prolonged period of uncertainty. Some communities had already been drawn into guerrilla support networks, supplying labor and information. Others found themselves between Japanese positions and advancing American units. Bombardment and infantry attacks along the ridges prompted movements of people toward the coast, or deeper into the interior, depending on local assessments of risk and access to food. Both sides were aware that civilian cooperation or hostility could affect security in rear areas, but the pattern of fighting, shifting lines, dispersed positions, and night activity made comprehensive control difficult. Meteorological considerations added another layer of urgency. Allied planners had timed operations in the southern Philippines to precede the onset of heavier seasonal rains, which in earlier campaigns had complicated road construction and airfield work. As the inland battle developed in March, staff at 8th Army and within the 41st Division monitored weather conditions closely, aware that deteriorating ground conditions could limit air support and slow supply movement just as combat in the hills was reaching its most demanding stage. By the third week of March, the combination of prepared defenses, difficult terrain, and nightly countermeasures had turned the inland advance into a sustained and resource-intensive effort. Casualties on both sides increased compared to the opening landings, and the division's progress was measured in short distances along key ridges rather than in rapid territorial gains. Within this environment, command decisions at divisional and brigade level about where to concentrate attacks, when to commit reserves, and how to coordinate guerrilla blocking positions became central to how the campaign would develop in the final days of March. By the third week of March 1945, the inland battle north of Zamboanga City reached its most intense phase. 2 regiments of the 41st Infantry Division, the 162nd and 163rd, were now in continuous contact with the main positions of the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade along a 5-mile front, anchored on the Capizan and Pulangbata ridges. The Japanese defensive belt, in places up to 3 miles deep, combined barbed wire, booby-trapped abandoned ground, minefields including some with remote detonation, and bunkers sited to cover narrow approaches with machine gun and mortar fire. Behind artillery barrages and close air support from Marine and Army aircraft operating from newly prepared strips, the 41st Division pressed forward ridge by ridge. On the western and central sectors, the 162nd Infantry advanced from the San Roque and Malisay areas toward Mount Capisan. On the east, the 163rd Infantry pushed up the Tumaga Valley toward Mount Pulangbata, 5 miles inland. Progress was measured in short distances. Bulldozers cut supply tracks along the slopes, while infantry companies climbed on foot, often using rope and improvised steps to move weapons and ammunition up steep, muddy gradients. For the Japanese side, this period represented the full commitment of General Tokichi Hojo's prepared defenses. Initial stocks of automatic weapons and mortar ammunition allowed his units to answer each American advance with coordinated fire and repeated night counterattacks. Small groups moved forward after dark to test new positions, lay additional mines, and attempt to disrupt road-building parties. While overall morale on the peninsula was assessed by U.S. reports as lower than that of some formations on Luzon, many members of the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade continued to fight effectively as long as they could rely on their pre-constructed positions and understood the defensive system in which they were embedded. Command decisions during these days focused on where to concentrate effort along the ridgeline. Division headquarters and regimental staffs analyzed daily reports from company-level patrols to identify sectors where defensive fire was thinning or positions appeared incomplete. On approximately 20th March, sustained pressure began to show results. Observers recorded signs that the brigade's front was starting to fragment, with gaps opening between its central and eastern components. Around 23rd March, the 41st Division succeeded in driving a wedge between Japanese forces in the Mount Pulangbata and Mount Capisan sectors, creating opportunities to attack individual strongpoints from the flanks rather than only from directly below. The culmination of this phase came in the central sector. On 25th March, after several days of coordinated infantry, artillery, and air attacks, the 162nd Infantry overran the last organized resistance around Mount Capisan. Remnants of Hojo's Central Defense Group were forced northward off the ridge into more broken terrain. The western unit, which had originally held hills above Caldera Bay, had already been weakened by transfers of personnel to reinforce the center. The eastern unit, facing the 163rd Infantry, had incurred significant losses along the Tumaga approaches. The capture of Capisan did not end the campaign, but shifted its balance. The main Japanese position that directly overlooked the coastal airfield area was now in Allied hands. Rotation and reinforcement accompanied these tactical gains. On 26th March, the 186th Infantry, with most of its battalions now free after operations on Palawan, began relieving the 163rd Infantry in the eastern sector. Fresh companies extended the front and moved north on March 30th and 31st, against resistance that reports describe as diminishing, but still organized. For the division, this rotation aimed to sustain pressure on remaining positions, without overextending units that had been engaged continuously since the 10th of March landings. Civilian experiences during this peak phase varied by location. In areas now behind Allied lines, residents were drawn into labor details for road work, transport, and airfield maintenance, often in coordination with guerrilla organizations that had maintained contact with Furtick's command throughout the occupation. In and around the contested ridges, villages were partly emptied as people moved either toward the coast under American control or into more remote interior valleys to avoid bombardment and patrol clashes. Food distribution, already disrupted by years of occupation and restricted shipping, depended increasingly on local production and limited military rations shared through guerrilla channels. At the same time, the wider Victor 4 operation reached a high point of activity beyond the peninsula itself. On 16th March, a reinforced company from the 162nd Infantry had landed unopposed on Bazalan Island south of Zamboanga, transferring garrison duties to guerrilla units once patrols confirmed the absence of significant Japanese forces. As inland fighting near Kapisan and Pulangbata intensified, 8th Army authorized further moves down the Sulu archipelago. On April 2nd, the reinforced 2nd Battalion of the 163rd Infantry went ashore on Sanga in the Tawi-Tawi group, encountering only limited mortar and machine gun fire from nearby Bangao, and completing clearance of both islands by April 6th at a cost of 2 U.S. soldiers killed and 4 wounded. Approximately 30 Japanese defenders were killed. For Japanese planners, these concurrent landings underscored the broader strategic situation. The Zamboanga garrison was no longer part of a continuous defensive chain reaching toward Borneo, but was instead one of several isolated bodies of troops being compressed by combined amphibious, air, and guerrilla actions. On the peninsula, the disintegration of the Kapazan sector and the arrival of fresh Allied units on the east signaled that the period of holding prepared positions was nearing its limit. As March ended, surviving elements of the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade faced a choice between maintaining remaining ridge defenses in place or breaking contact and attempting to withdraw into the peninsula's interior, where terrain offered concealment, but where supplies were more difficult to obtain. The decisions taken in these days set the conditions for the withdrawals and pursuit that followed in early April. As organized resistance on the Kapisan and Pulangbata ridges began to loosen at the end of March, both sides adjusted their methods to the changing situation. For the 41st Infantry Division, the initial pattern of frontal assaults up narrow approaches gave way to more flexible tactics, exploiting gaps between Japanese positions. Patrols pushed laterally along ridge crests to identify flanks and rear access routes, while artillery shifted from broad preparatory barrages to more concentrated fire on specific bunkers and suspected command posts identified by forward observers. Japanese units of the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade adapted by thinning their forward lines and increasing reliance on small groups operating at night. Rather than hold every position to the last, some detachments withdrew from exposed bunkers before daylight attacks, leaving behind mines and booby traps to slow the advance. Others detached small teams to infiltrate through undergrowth and rugged ravines, aiming at ammunition dumps, communication lines, and engineer work parties, whose loss could significantly delay the Allied timetable, even if frontline ground was eventually given up. Guerrilla forces also modified their role as the front moved north, having helped close the main coastal road at Bilong and contributed guides and scouts to the division's columns. They now focused more on intercepting small Japanese parties, attempting to bypass the main battle area. In some districts, guerrilla units established temporary checkpoints on trails used for local trade, combining intelligence gathering with efforts to prevent the movement of Japanese stragglers toward more remote parts of the peninsula. This activity reduced the risk that scattered groups could reorganize into larger bodies capable of striking at supply routes. Inside the 41st Division, resource management became a central concern. The rate of artillery expenditure during the ridge fighting was high, and staff officers monitored shell use to ensure that ammunition, stocks at the beachhead, and in forward dumps remained adequate for prolonged operations. Engineers prioritized the improvement of a limited number of roads and tracks, focusing on those that supported both combat units and medical evacuation. Water purification, ration distribution, and maintenance of vehicles operating under heavy load on steep gradients required continual adjustment of work schedules and repair capacity. For Japanese commanders, adaptation increasingly meant adjusting expectations to shrinking resources. As ammunition for heavier weapons diminished, defensive fire relied more on rifles and light machine guns, conserving mortar rounds for attempts to break up concentrations on the roads or around new American command posts. Medical care, already constrained by shortages of supplies, became more rudimentary as established aid stations were overrun or had to be abandoned in the course of withdrawals. In some units, written records indicate that rations were cut and foraging increased, with small parties sent to collect food from abandoned villages or from plots cultivated during the occupation. The psychological dimension of this phase affected participants on all sides. For American infantrymen, the combination of slow, physically demanding progress and intermittent night fighting produced fatigue even as visible gains on the map remained limited. Commanders attempted to mitigate this through rotation of frontline companies, brief rest periods at lower elevations, and the use of air support to reduce the need for repeated direct assaults on well-sited bunkers. For Japanese soldiers, the erosion of a carefully prepared defensive line and the visible extension of Allied control along the Sulu Sea coastline challenged assumptions that the peninsula could be held as an integrated position. Civilians adapted to the shifting lines in practical ways. In areas firmly under Allied control, local administrations, often supported by guerrilla organizations and returning officials, began to re-establish basic services such as market regulation and limited schooling, even while artillery could still be heard from the hills. In contested zones, families moved repeatedly in response to bombardments, patrol reports, or rumors of approaching troops, balancing the desire to preserve homes and crops against the risks of remaining too close to active positions. Some residents provided labor to both sides at different times, under compulsion or through arrangements made to secure food and relative safety. Innovation appeared not only in tactics but also in communication and coordination. Forward observers experimented with standardized reference grids for calling air and artillery strikes in the steep inland terrain, reducing the time between identification of a target and the arrival of fire. Liaison between division headquarters, guerrilla commands, and civil authorities was formalized through regular meetings and designated contact officers, allowing information about road conditions, supply needs, and security issues to move more systematically than in the first days after the landing. By early April, these patterns of resistance and adaptation had reshaped the campaign. The 41st Infantry Division had transformed its initial beachhead force into a network of mutually supporting positions, extending from the coastal airfields deep into the ridge system. The 54th Independent Mixed Brigade, having expended much of its strength in holding and counterattacking along Kapisan and Pulungbada, now faced the prospect of continued action without the structured defenses on which its original plan had relied. Guerrilla forces and civilian communities, having adjusted repeatedly to the evolving front, were positioned to play a significant role in the next phase, the pursuit of withdrawing Japanese elements into the northern and interior parts of the Zamboanga Peninsula. By early April 1945, the pattern of combat on the Zamboanga Peninsula shifted from positional battles on fixed ridges to a contest over movement and escape. The capture of Mount Kapisan and the weakening of Japanese positions around Mount Pulungbada deprived the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade of its main defensive system, overlooking Zamboanga City and the coastal airfields. The question now was whether the surviving units could break away into the northern interior in sufficient order to continue organized resistance, or whether they would fragment into small groups under pressure from multiple directions. The turning point emerged as the inland road and trail network north of the former ridgeline came under increasingly tight Allied and guerrilla control, with the 162nd and 186th Infantry pushing beyond the old Kapisan and Pulungbada positions. American commanders directed fresh efforts toward blocking likely withdrawal routes running along valleys and over lower passes. Patrols were assigned to seize key junctions and high points that dominated tracks leading toward the interior, while artillery observers adjusted their coverage to include areas previously beyond range from the coastal plain. For the Japanese side, the loss of contiguous prepared defenses forced a change from holding ground to attempting stage withdrawals. Orders were issued for units to pull back from exposed forward positions at night, leaving small delaying groups and explosive devices behind. Columns of troops, often reduced in strength by casualties and illness, moved along secondary trails carrying what supplies they could salvage from abandoned bunkers. The intention was to reach more remote areas of the peninsula, where terrain and vegetation might offset Allied advantages, and where small garrisons could survive longer on limited resources. Guerrilla forces became central at this junction. Units already positioned at Belong and in nearby districts tightened their control over the main East Coast Road and adjacent trails. Reports from this period describe engagements in which guerrilla patrols exchanged fire with withdrawing Japanese groups, sometimes holding them in place long enough for regular infantry or air support to intervene. In other cases, they concentrated on observation, providing coordinates and movement estimates that allowed artillery and aircraft to target withdrawal routes rather than only fixed positions. Inside the 41st Division, command assessments increasingly concluded that organized Japanese resistance as a coherent brigade was nearing its end. Intelligence officers compared prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and contact reports to map the disintegration of command links between the central, western, and eastern components of the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade, where earlier in March the brigade had maintained a defensive belt several kilometers deep. By early April, surviving elements appeared as clusters of platoon or company-sized groups moving north in search of cover, food, and water. The character of civilian encounters reflected this transition. Villagers along likely withdrawal paths reported small, hurried groups of Japanese soldiers passing through at night, often avoiding contact and taking what food they could find. In areas now under stable Allied control, local authorities and guerrilla leaders coordinated to manage flows of displaced civilians returning from the interior or moving away from reported Japanese movements. The contrast between relatively ordered conditions around Zamboanga City and the fluid situation in the northern hills highlighted how the battle's center of gravity had shifted. Air operations during this phase reinforced the emerging turning point. With runways at San Roque and other nearby sites fully operational, aircraft could respond more rapidly to sightings of movement on roads and open stretches of trail. Pilots were briefed to look not only for fixed installations, but also for small groups in column formation, campfires, or signs of recently cleared vegetation, indicating temporary bivouacs. While much of the peninsula remained heavily forested, these methods added pressure on withdrawing units that could no longer rely on extended periods of undisturbed movement. For Japanese commanders, the cumulative effect was a narrowing set of options. Attempts to regroup sizable bodies of troops in new defensive positions were hampered by losses in officers and non-commissioned officers, shortages of communications equipment, and the need to avoid daytime movement. As march distances increased and food stocks dwindled, more soldiers fell behind or became separated from their units. Some groups attempted to dig in on secondary ridges farther north, but without the elaborate preparations that had characterized the original Kapisan-Pulungbata belt. By the middle of April, this combination of factors, collapsed primary defenses, controlled coastal routes, active guerrilla blocking, and persistent air and ground pursuit, had transformed the Battle of Zamboanga. The shift was not marked by a single decisive engagement, but by a sequence of decisions and movements that gradually made continued organized resistance on the peninsula untenable. What began as a contest over a fortified ridge system had become, by the turning point of early April, a struggle over survival and dispersal for the remaining elements of the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade, and a transition for Allied forces from major offensive combat toward pursuit and consolidation. By mid-April 1945, large-scale engagements on the Zamboanga Peninsula had declined, but organized mopping-up operations continued. The 41st Infantry Division maintained patrols north and northeast of the former main line, around Kapisan and Pulungbata. supported by artillery on call and aircraft, able to reach most of the peninsula from airstrips near Zamboanga City. Units advanced along selected valleys and ridge systems, marking cleared areas on maps and assigning follow-on patrols to verify that no Japanese groups had returned. For the remaining elements of the 54th Independent Mixed Brigade, this period was defined by fragmentation. Some units, still under officers with access to written orders, attempted to establish new positions on secondary ridges farther north, constructing simple foxholes and improvised shelters without the extensive bunker networks of the earlier defensive belt. Others broke up into platoon and squad-sized groups moving independently through forested areas, seeking water sources and farmland where small quantities of food could be obtained. Contact reports from American and guerrilla patrols describe ambushes, short firefights, and occasional surrenders rather than sustained battles. Casualty and strength figures illustrate the scale of attrition. Before the landings, Allied intelligence had estimated that approximately 9,000 Japanese personnel, including service troops, were present on the Zamboanga Peninsula. By the time 8th Army declared the peninsula secured, roughly two-thirds of these had been reported killed in action or found dead in abandoned positions, with a smaller number captured or surrendering. For the 41st Division and attached units, the campaign cost approximately 220 soldiers killed and around 660 wounded in the period from 10th March through the end of organized operations, reflecting the combination of low-resistance initial landings and higher losses in the inland ridge fighting and subsequent patrol clashes. Withdrawal in this context did not mean evacuation by sea or air for the Japanese garrison. With Allied naval and air control over the Sulu Sea and surrounding waters, no significant extraction was possible. Instead, withdrawal took the form of movement away from the main battle area into more remote interior regions. Some groups attempted to reach the northern extremities of the peninsula, others moved eastward toward sparsely populated valleys. As supplies dwindled, disease and malnutrition increased, further reducing effective strength even in units that avoided direct combat. Guerrilla forces and local communities played a central role in this final phase. Guerrilla patrols, familiar with terrain and settlement patterns, continued to monitor trails, river crossings, and coastal inlets. They reported sightings of Japanese groups to American headquarters, guided regular patrols to suspected camps, and, in some cases, accepted surrenders from small parties who approached villages seeking food or medical help. Civilians, for their part, balanced the risks of notifying authorities against the danger of retaliation from any remaining armed groups, making decisions that depended on local relationships and recent experiences during occupation. For residents of Zamboanga City and nearby barrios, the end of major combat operations meant a gradual return to damaged streets and buildings. The pre-war urban area had experienced bombardment, fires, and the effects of temporary fortification. Clearing operations removed unexploded artillery shells, aerial bombs, and mines. Market activity resumed in stages as traders returned by road and sea, though transport remained limited, and price structures were disrupted by scarcity of some goods. Schools, churches, and administrative offices reopened depending on the availability of staff and materials, often in repaired or improvised facilities. Humanitarian issues persisted beyond the formal end of the campaign. Displaced families from interior villages required shelter and food until fields could be replanted and harvests restored. Medical teams treated wounds from the fighting, as well as illnesses associated with prolonged displacement, such as respiratory infections and digestive diseases. Mine and booby trap clearance became an ongoing task. Incidents involving civilians and returning farmers continued as long as unrecorded devices remained in the ground, around former defensive positions and along abandoned trails. The treatment of prisoners reflected both military and logistical considerations. Japanese soldiers who surrendered or were captured were assembled in temporary holding areas near the coast, where they were screened for rank and potential intelligence value. Interrogations focused on unit locations, remaining stockpiles, and any organized plans for continued resistance. After processing, prisoners were transferred to larger camps elsewhere in the theater. Filipino collaborators or individuals accused of assisting the occupation forces were subject to investigation by emerging local and national authorities, leading to a separate but related process of legal and political reckoning. The conclusion of organized combat on the Zamboanga Peninsula coincided with the extension of operations along the Sulu archipelago, so some units that had fought in the inland campaign were redeployed rather than demobilized. Elements of the 163rd Infantry, after participation in the pursuit north of Zamboanga City, took part in landings on islands such as Sanga and Bongao, where resistance was lighter but still required coordinated infantry, naval, and air action. This overlapping of operations meant that, for many participants, there was no clear break between the Battle of Zamboanga and subsequent engagements in the same region. By late April and May, 8th Army reports increasingly described the peninsula as an area of garrison and security duties rather than active frontline combat. Checkpoints monitored movement along main roads, patrols continued into more remote areas on a reduced scale, and engineers shifted from purely military construction to projects with civil applications, such as repairs to ports and roads needed for commercial traffic. However, the presence of isolated Japanese groups in forests and mountains remained a factor until the wider Japanese surrender in August, and in some cases, even beyond, requiring occasional operations to disarm or repatriate individuals who had not received or accepted news of the war's end. In this way, the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Zamboanga combined elements of closure and continuity. The peninsula was no longer a contested operational objective, and the main goals of securing airfields and ports had been achieved. Yet the processes of clearing remaining armed groups, restoring civil life, and addressing the material and social consequences of occupation and combat extended well beyond the dates on which military authorities declared the campaign complete. In the wider chronology of the Pacific War, the Battle of Zamboanga formed one component of a larger sequence rather than a standalone event. Militarily, its immediate result was the establishment of secure airfields and port facilities on the western side of Mindanao, facing the Sulu and Celebes seas. From these bases, Allied aircraft and naval units intensified operations against Japanese shipping routes, linking the Philippines with Borneo and the Netherlands East Indies. In combination with earlier gains on Leyte and Luzon and subsequent landings along the Sulu archipelago, Zamboanga contributed to the progressive isolation of Japanese forces in the southern Philippines and in the remaining resource areas to the southwest. For 8th Army and the 41st Infantry Division, the campaign became a case study in mid-war amphibious and joint operations. The relatively low resistance during the initial landings illustrated how naval and air bombardment, combined with Japanese decisions to defend inland, could produce a rapid lodgment on shore. The inland fighting around Mount Kapisan and Mount Pulangbata, in contrast, highlighted the limits of firepower in steep forested terrain and the importance of engineer support, road construction, and sustained logistics. After-action reports discussed the coordination of artillery and close air support in restricted visibility, the integration of guerrilla intelligence, and the rotation of units in protracted operations, influencing planning for later landings in Borneo and elsewhere. From the Japanese perspective, Zamboanga formed part of the progressive contraction of a defensive perimeter that could no longer be maintained as an integrated system. The 54th Independent Mixed Brigade and associated units defended the peninsula for several weeks, then fragmented under pressure, with many soldiers dying in place or dispersing into remote areas. For commanders in the southern Philippines, the campaign underlined the consequences of fuel and shipping shortages, limited ammunition, and the inability to reinforce or evacuate garrisons once Allied naval and air control were established. In Japanese post-war analyses, Zamboanga appears mainly as an example of a local defense conducted under conditions in which larger strategic decisions had already constrained the outcome. For Filipino guerrilla forces and civilians, the battle marked both the culmination of years of clandestine activity and the beginning of a complex post-war transition. Guerrilla units that had provided intelligence, guides, and blocking forces during the campaign emerged with enhanced local authority. some leaders entered formal military or political roles in the restored Philippine state. Others returned to civilian occupations, but retained influence within their communities. At the same time, questions arose about wartime collaboration, property disputes, and the distribution of scarce resources in the immediate post-liberation period. The memory of who had resisted, who had cooperated, and under what circumstances became part of local narratives that persisted long after the fighting ended. The civilian impact of the battle and its aftermath extended beyond direct casualties. Damage to Zamboanga city's infrastructure and surrounding villages required years of reconstruction. Roads and bridges built or improved for military purposes became the backbone of post-war land transport in the region, while repaired or newly constructed airfields and port facilities formed the basis for renewed commerce. Agricultural production, disrupted by displacement, requisitions, and the presence of minefields and unexploded ordnance, had to be re-established before food supplies stabilized. These processes linked the military history of Zamboanga with longer-term economic and social developments in western Mindanao. In historical writing, the battle occupies an intermediate position. It is not as prominent in international narratives as Leyte, Luzon, Iwo Jima, or Okinawa, yet it appears regularly in studies of the southern Philippines and of Eighth Army operations. Analysts interested in combined operations point to Zamboanga as an example of coordinated action between regular forces and guerrillas, and between land, sea, and air components, conducted after the main strategic initiative had already shifted to the Allies. Others examine it as part of the debate over the scope of the Philippine campaign, whether resources devoted to multiple oiland operations, including Zamboanga, accelerated Japan's isolation and collapse, or whether a more limited approach could have achieved comparable strategic results. In the Philippines, commemoration of the battle combines national and local elements. Official histories and memorials situate Zamboanga within the broader narrative of liberation, emphasizing the sequence of operations that ended occupation and restored sovereignty. At the regional level, markers, ceremonies, and school curricula often give more detailed attention to the roles of local guerrillas, communities, and specific neighborhoods in and around the city. For many residents, the legacy is preserved not only in formal monuments, but also in family accounts of evacuation, service, and reconstruction. In the United States, remembrance of Zamboanga is more specialized. Veterans associations, divisional histories, and archival collections preserve records of the 41st Division's campaign, including photographs, maps, and letters. For those who study the operational history of Eighth Army, the battle illustrates the transition from the large, early campaigns in New Guinea and the Central Philippines to a pattern of multiple overlapping operations in secondary theaters that nonetheless required careful planning and incurred significant risk for those involved. Japanese memory of the campaign is less prominent in public discourse, but appears in unit histories, personal memoirs, and broader works on the final stages of the war. These accounts often emphasize the difficulties of supply, the experience of fighting in isolation, and the circumstances of death or survival in forests and mountains far from the main islands. The fate of those who surrendered or remained in the region after 1945 forms part of the wider story of repatriation and post-war adjustment for former soldiers. Historians continue to analyze the Battle of Zamboanga within several overlapping frameworks, as a tactical and operational episode in the southern Philippines, as a case in the evolution of Allied Amphibious Doctrine, as a component of the economic strangulation of Japan's war effort through the cutting of sea lanes, and as a local event that reshaped communities in western Mindanao. Its legacy lies less in a single dramatic turning point than in the cumulative effects it had on logistics, regional control, and the lived experiences of those who fought, governed, or simply tried to persist in a contested landscape. Viewed in this way, Zamboanga's significance rests on the intersection of levels: high command decisions directing resources to the southern Philippines, operational choices made by divisional and brigade staffs, tactical actions on ridges and in villages, and the responses of civilians whose lives were shaped by these events. The battle concluded as one of many campaigns in the final year of the Pacific War, but its impact on the region's infrastructure, political structures, and historical memory ensured that its traces would remain visible long after the last patrols returned, and the formal documents of surrender were signed elsewhere.